The gunshot echoed through the small church in Dry Creek, Montana, causing everyone in attendance to duck reflexively, everyone except Josephine Evans, who stood paralyzed in her white wedding gown, one hand instinctively protecting the small swell of her stomach beneath the carefully arranged fabric. Her fiancé, Thomas Wheeler, had just fired his pistol into the air before announcing to the assembled guests that he would not be marrying a woman carrying another man's bastard. It was 1878, and as Thomas stormed out of the church, Josephine felt her world collapsing. The secret she had desperately kept, that Thomas himself was the father of her unborn child, was now exposed in the most humiliating way possible. Tears streamed down her face as whispers rippled through the pews. "I always knew she wasn't decent," someone muttered. "Poor Thomas," another voice added. From the back of the church, a tall figure rose. Isaac Blackburn had been watching the ceremony from the last pew, his weathered cowboy hat in his hands. He had come to town just 3 days prior, looking for ranch work and a fresh start. He'd only met Josephine once, when she had kindly directed him to the general store upon his arrival. Now, as the murmurs grew louder and Josephine's shoulders began to shake with silent sobs, Isaac found himself walking forward, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. The crowd grew silent as he made his way to the altar. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice calm and steady despite the tension that filled the small church. "I believe you deserve better than this." Josephine looked up at him through tear-filled eyes, confusion evident on her face. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough," Isaac replied, extending his hand toward her. "I know that no woman deserves to be abandoned like this, especially not in your condition." He paused, then added softly so only she could hear, "I can offer you protection, a name for your child, and a promise I will stand by you for as long as you need." The church had fallen into shocked silence. Josephine stared at Isaac's outstretched hand, her mind racing. She had no family in Dry Creek, having moved west from Boston just a year ago to teach at the local school. Her parents had passed away, leaving her alone in the world except for Thomas, who had courted her relentlessly until she gave in to his charms and his false promises of marriage once she discovered her condition. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Isaac's eyes, a deep blue that reminded her of mountain lakes, held her steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because no one should face the world alone." Josephine hesitated only a moment longer before placing her trembling hand in his. She had few options: become a social outcast, leave town in disgrace, or accept this stranger's unexpected offer of marriage. At least with the latter, her child might have a chance at a decent life. "Reverend Phillips," Isaac called to the stunned minister. "I believe we still have a wedding to perform today." A collective gasp went through the church. Josephine's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. This man, this cowboy she barely knew, was offering to marry her, to give her child a name, to save her from disgrace. "Young man," the Reverend began, clearly flustered, "this is most irregular. I cannot simply—" "You can and you will," Isaac interrupted firmly. "Unless you prefer to explain to your congregation why you turned away a couple seeking the Lord's blessing on their union." The Reverend hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well." And so, under the astonished gazes of the townspeople who had come to witness one wedding and were now witnessing quite another, Josephine Evans became Mrs. Isaac Blackburn. The ceremony was brief, the traditional words spoken in haste, and when Isaac placed a gentle kiss on her lips to seal their vows, Josephine felt nothing but bewilderment and gratitude. As they walked down the aisle together, her arm looped through his, she leaned close to whisper, "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Isaac replied quietly. "We have a long road ahead." Outside the church, Isaac helped Josephine into a borrowed wagon. The townspeople had begun to disperse, many shooting disapproving glances their way. Josephine's intended reception dinner would not be happening, and the cake that Mrs. Wilson had spent 3 days preparing would go uneaten. "Where are we going?" Josephine asked as Isaac took the reins. "I've been hired at the Rockingham Ranch about 10 miles outside town," he explained. The foreman agreed to let me use one of the old cabins on the property. It's not much, but it's shelter. Josephine nodded silently, her mind still reeling from the day's events. Just hours ago, she had been preparing to marry Thomas, a man she had come to love despite his occasional cruel streak. Now she was married to a complete stranger, headed for a cabin she had never seen, carrying a child that would now bear another man's name. As they left the town behind, Josephine allowed herself one last look at the life she was leaving. Dry Creek had never truly accepted her, the Eastern schoolteacher with her fancy education and city ways. Perhaps this new life, uncertain as it was, would offer something the old one never could, a fresh start. "Mr. Blackburn," she began hesitantly. "Isaac," he corrected. "I reckon you should call me Isaac, considering we're married now." "Isaac," she repeated, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. "I want you to know that I don't expect. That is, I understand this is a marriage of convenience. You don't have to." He glanced at her, understanding in his eyes. "I made you a promise, Josephine. I will honor that promise. You have my word." The ride to the Rockingham Ranch was mostly silent after that. Josephine watched the landscape change from the small town to the open prairie, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. The Montana Territory stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, yet somehow beautiful in its wildness. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The main house stood on a hill, with the bunkhouse and various outbuildings scattered around it. Isaac guided the wagon past these toward a small cabin set apart from the rest, near a copse of trees. "It's not much," he said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but I've spent the last couple days cleaning it up. There's a new mattress on the bed, and I stocked some basic supplies." The cabin was indeed small, just one room with a stone fireplace, a bed in the corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs and a few shelves. But it was clean, and someone, Isaac, she presumed, had placed a bunch of wildflowers in a jar on the table. "It's fine," she said, suddenly overcome with exhaustion. The emotional turmoil of the day was catching up to her. "Thank you." Isaac nodded, then gestured to the bed. "You should rest. I'll tend to the horses and bring in your things. Where will you sleep?" she asked, suddenly realizing the implications of their living arrangement. "I'll make a pallet by the fire," he answered simply. "Don't worry about me." True to his word, Isaac brought in the few trunks that contained Josephine's possessions, clothes, books, and the small keepsakes that were all she had left of her family. He then disappeared outside again, returning later with a plate of food. "Mrs. Keller from the main house sent this over," he explained, setting the plate on the table. "Word travels fast. She said to tell you welcome." Josephine picked at the food, her appetite non-existent despite having eaten nothing since early morning. Isaac busied himself making his bed near the fireplace, giving her as much privacy as the small cabin would allow. "Isaac," she said finally, setting down her fork, "why did you really do this? The truth, please." He paused in his task, considering her question. "I've seen what happens to women in your situation," he said after a moment. "My sister found herself in similar circumstances. The man who promised to marry her vanished when he found out about the baby. She tried to make it on her own, but—" He trailed off, pain evident in his expression. "She didn't survive the birth, neither did her child. I wasn't there to help her then, but I'm here now, and I couldn't stand by and watch history repeat itself." Josephine felt tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry about your sister." "So am I," he said quietly. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day." As Josephine lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night and the steady breathing of the stranger who was now her husband, she placed a protective hand over her stomach and whispered a promise to her unborn child. "We're going to be all right." The next morning dawned bright and clear. Josephine woke to find Isaac already gone, a note on the table informing her that he had gone to work and would return at midday to check on her. A pot of coffee sat warming by the fire, and he had left bread and preserves for her breakfast. She spent the morning arranging her few possessions, trying to make the cabin feel more like home. It was a far cry from the comfortable house in town she would have shared with Thomas, but there was something appealing about its simplicity, Around noon, as promised, Isaac returned. He looked different in the daylight, younger than she had initially thought, perhaps only a few years older than her own 22 years. His face was tanned from outdoor work, and his hands were calloused, but there was a gentleness in his movements that belied his rugged appearance. "How are you feeling?" he asked, removing his hat as he entered. "I'm well, thank you," she replied formally, still unsure how to act around this man who was both stranger and husband. "I spoke with Mr. Morgan, he owns the ranch," Isaac explained. "He said you're welcome to stay here with me." His wife also mentioned that they could use help with the bookkeeping if you're interested in earning some money of your own. Josephine was surprised by this offer. "That's very kind. I would like that. I was a teacher, before everything." Isaac nodded. "I figured you were educated. The way you speak gives it away." "And you?" she asked, curious about the man who had so drastically altered her life. "Where are you from?" "All over," he replied with a slight shrug. "Born in Kentucky, but my family moved west when I was young. Spent time in Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, been working ranches since I was 15. "And your family," a shadow crossed his face. "Gone now. My parents died of fever when I was 18. My sister, as I told you, passed a few years back." "I'm sorry," Josephine said softly. "My parents are gone too. Father died in the war and mother passed last year. That's why I came west. There was nothing left for me in Boston." A moment of understanding passed between them, two orphans who had found themselves alone in the world, now unexpectedly tied to each other. "Well," Isaac said, breaking the silence, "I should get back to work. Will you be all right until evening?" Josephine nodded. "Yes, I'll be fine. Thank you for checking on me." As the days turned into weeks, they settled into a routine. Isaac would rise before dawn to begin his work on the ranch, leaving Josephine to sleep. She would wake later, prepare for the day, and walk to the main house 3 times a week to help Mrs. Morgan with the ranch accounts. The older woman had welcomed her warmly, asking no questions about her hasty marriage or her condition. In the evenings, Isaac would return, tired but always taking time to chop wood, fetch water, or make repairs to their small cabin. They would share a simple dinner, during which they slowly began to learn about each other. Josephine discovered that Isaac was well-read despite his lack of formal education, often borrowing books from Mr. Morgan's library. Isaac learned that Josephine had a quick wit and a passion for teaching that extended beyond the classroom. Their sleeping arrangements remained as they had begun, Josephine in the bed, Isaac on his pallet by the fire. He never pressed for more, treating her with a respect that she had not expected. As her pregnancy progressed and her body changed, Josephine found herself increasingly grateful for Isaac's steady presence. When morning sickness plagued her, he would bring her ginger tea. When her back ached from the growing weight of the child, he fashioned extra pillows to support her as she slept. One evening, about a month after their unusual wedding, Josephine was sitting outside the cabin, enjoying the cool evening air when Isaac returned from work. He looked troubled, his usual calm demeanor disturbed. "What is it?" she asked as he dismounted from his horse. "Thomas Wheeler is in town," he said without preamble. "Mr. Morgan mentioned it when I was finishing up today." Josephine felt her heart skip a beat at the mention of her former fiancé's name. "Did he say what Thomas wants?" Isaac shook his head. "No, but I thought you should know." She nodded, absently placing a hand on her growing belly. "Thank you for telling me." That night, as they sat at their small table eating the stew Josephine had prepared, she found herself speaking of Thomas for the first time since their wedding day. "He wasn't always cruel," she said quietly. "When we first met, he was charming, attentive. He made me feel less alone in a strange town, but when I told him about the baby, everything changed. He accused me of trying to trap him, said terrible things." Isaac listened silently, his expression unreadable. "The worst part," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "is that I believed him when he finally agreed to marry me. I thought he had changed his mind, that he would accept our child." She blinked back tears. "I was a fool." "No," Isaac said firmly. "You weren't a fool, you were hopeful." "There's a difference." They sat in silence for a moment before Isaac spoke again. "If he comes here, if he tries to cause trouble, I want you to know that I'll protect you, both of you." He nodded toward her stomach. Josephine felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Thank you, Isaac." 2 days later, as Josephine was returning from her work at the main house, she saw a familiar figure on horseback approaching the cabin. Thomas Wheeler sat tall in his saddle, his expensive suit and polished boots a stark contrast to the rugged landscape around him. She paused, her heart racing, unsure whether to continue forward or retreat to the safety of the main house. Before she could decide, Thomas had spotted her and urged his horse in her direction. "Josephine," he called, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "I need to speak with you." Drawing a deep breath, Josephine steeled herself and continued walking toward the cabin. She would not show fear, not to this man who had humiliated her so publicly. Thomas dismounted as she approached, tying his horse to a nearby post. His eyes immediately went to her stomach, where her pregnancy was now clearly visible despite her loose dress. "So it's true," he said, his tone somewhere between disgust and fascination. "You really are with child." "What do you want, Thomas?" Josephine asked, keeping her voice steady. "I came to see if the rumors were true that you married some drifter the same day I left you at the altar." He laughed without humor. "I must say you didn't waste any time." "My husband is a good man," she replied, emphasizing the word husband. "More of a man than you ever were." Thomas's face darkened. "Watch your tongue, Josephine. You forget I know what kind of woman you really are." "And what kind is that?" came a new voice. Isaac had appeared seemingly from nowhere, his expression calm but his eyes hard as steel. Thomas turned, sizing up the cowboy who now stood between him and Josephine. "You must be the fool who took my leavings," he sneered. "Tell me, do you enjoy raising another man's bastard?" In one fluid motion, Isaac closed the distance between them and grabbed Thomas by the collar. "That child is mine in every way that matters," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And Josephine is my wife. You would do well to remember that." Thomas struggled against Isaac's grip but couldn't break free. "Unhand me, you savage." "Gladly," Isaac replied, releasing him with enough force that Thomas stumbled backward. "Now get on your horse and ride away. If I see you near my wife again, we'll have more than words." For a moment it seemed Thomas might challenge him, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. But something in Isaac's unwavering gaze must have given him pause. With a final glare at Josephine, he mounted his horse and rode away. Josephine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said softly. Isaac turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" She nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Yes, just shaken." Without hesitation, Isaac stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her in a protective embrace. It was the first time he had held her like this, and Josephine found herself leaning into his strength, drawing comfort from his steady heartbeat against her cheek. "He won't bother you again," Isaac promised quietly. That night, as they prepared for bed, Josephine found herself reluctant to be alone, the confrontation with Thomas having stirred up old fears and insecurities. "Isaac," she said hesitantly as he laid out his pallet by the fire. Would you mind sleeping beside me tonight?" "Just to sleep," she added quickly. "I don't want to be alone." Isaac looked up at her, surprise evident in his eyes, but he nodded. "Of course." The bed was narrow, but they managed to fit, lying side by side with a careful space between them. Despite the awkwardness, Josephine felt safer than she had in a long time, the solid presence of Isaac beside her a reassurance against the darkness. "Josephine," Isaac said softly into the quiet of the night, "I want you to know that I meant what I said today. That child is mine. Not by blood, perhaps, but in my heart. I will raise it as my own, love it as my own." Tears filled Josephine's eyes at his words. "Why are you so good to me, Isaac? You barely know me." In the dim light from the dying fire, she could just make out his profile as he turned to look at her. "Because from the moment I saw you in that church, something told me you were worth knowing, worth protecting." "Worth." He trailed off, but Josephine thought she understood what he couldn't say. Hesitantly, she reached out and found his hand in the darkness, intertwining her fingers with his. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental the first time she had reached for him rather than the other way around. As they lay there, hands joined in the space between them, Josephine felt something shift in her heart. This marriage might have begun as an arrangement of convenience, a desperate solution to an impossible situation, but perhaps it could become something more, something real. With that thought warming her mind, she drifted off to sleep, still holding the hand of the man who had promised her forever. The seasons changed, summer giving way to autumn, and as the land prepared for winter, Josephine's body prepared for birth. Her stomach grew rounder and the baby's movements became stronger, often visible through her clothing. Isaac watched these changes with a mixture of awe and concern, always attentive to her needs but careful to maintain the respectful distance he had established. Their sleeping arrangements had shifted since that night after Thomas's visit. While they now shared the bed, a certain formality remained between them, an unspoken agreement that they would take things slowly, if at all. Yet there were moments when the barriers seemed to thin. When Isaac's hand would linger on her shoulder as he passed her a cup of coffee. When Josephine would catch him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. When they would sit together in the evenings, reading or talking, and the conversation would flow so naturally that they would be surprised to find it was past midnight. One crisp October evening, as they walked back from dinner at the main house, Josephine felt the baby give a particularly strong kick. Without thinking, she grabbed Isaac's hand and placed it on her stomach. "Can you feel that?" she asked, smiling up at him. His eyes widened as the baby kicked again, right against his palm. "That's incredible," he breathed, his face filled with wonder. They stood there for a long moment, his hand on her belly, both of them feeling the life that moved within her. When the baby finally settled, neither of them moved immediately, the intimate moment stretching between them like a fragile thread. "Isaac," Josephine said softly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind through the prairie grass. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air, honest and vulnerable. For a terrifying moment, Josephine thought she had made a terrible mistake in voicing her feelings. But then Isaac's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch as gentle as his eyes were intense. "I think I fell in love with you the moment you put your hand in mine at that altar," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "But I promised myself I wouldn't tell you until I was sure you could feel the same way." With infinite tenderness, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, their first real kiss since the hasty peck that had sealed their wedding vows. Unlike that perfunctory touch, this kiss was warm and alive, full of promise and possibility. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Josephine felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. This man, this kind, honorable cowboy who had stepped forward when everyone else had stepped back, was now looking at her as though she were the most precious thing on earth. "We should get back to the cabin," Isaac said, though he made no move to release her. "It's getting cold." Josephine nodded, but before they continued their walk, she rose on her tiptoes to kiss him once more, sealing this new understanding between them. That night when they lay down together, the space between them vanished. Isaac held her close, her back against his chest, his arm protectively draped over her and their unborn child. For the first time since she had discovered her pregnancy, Josephine felt not just safe but truly cherished. As November arrived, bringing with it the first dusting of snow, Josephine's time drew near. Mrs. Morgan, who had become something of a mother figure to her, had arranged for the midwife from town to stay at the ranch during the last weeks of her pregnancy. "No sense in taking chances," the older woman had said firmly. "Winter babies wait for no one, and storms can make the roads impassable." Isaac had thrown himself into preparations with characteristic thoroughness. He reinforced the cabin against the coming winter, stocked up on supplies, and even built a small cradle, working on it in the evenings by the light of the fire. "It's beautiful," Josephine said one night as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood. "Where did you learn to make something like this?" "My father was a carpenter before he became a rancher," Isaac explained, a rare mention of his past. "He taught me the basics. I've never made a cradle before, but the principle is simple enough." "Our child will love it," Josephine said, the words "our child" feeling right on her tongue. Despite the circumstances of conception, this baby was theirs now, hers and Isaac's, bound together by love rather than blood. The first real snow came in the second week of November, transforming the landscape into a glistening white expanse. Josephine stood at the cabin window, watching the flakes swirl and dance in the wind, when she felt a sharp pain low in her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the windowsill for support. When the pain subsided, she took a deep breath, telling herself it was just another false contraction like the ones she had been experiencing for days. But when a second pain came stronger than the first, she knew. The baby was coming. Isaac had gone to the main house to help Mr. Morgan repair a broken wagon wheel. Josephine moved to the door, intending to send word to him and the midwife, but another contraction hit before she could reach it, forcing her to her knees. "Not yet," she whispered to her unborn child. "Not until your father is here." She managed to make it to the bed, where she lay breathing through the increasingly intense pains. Outside, the snow was falling faster, the wind howling around the corners of the cabin. She prayed that Isaac would return soon, that he would somehow know she needed him. As if in answer to her silent plea, the door burst open and Isaac appeared, snow dusting his shoulders and hat. "Josephine," he exclaimed, rushing to her side when he saw her clutching her stomach. "Is it time?" She nodded, relief washing over her at the sight of him. "Yes, the pains started about half an hour ago. They're getting stronger." Isaac wasted no time. He helped her into a more comfortable position, placing pillows behind her back, then rushed back out into the storm to fetch the midwife. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and effort for Josephine. The midwife, a stern but kind woman named Mrs. Holden, arrived with Isaac and took charge immediately. Isaac was sent to boil water and gather clean linens, tasks he performed with nervous efficiency. "You're doing well," Mrs. Holden reassured Josephine as she checked her progress. "The baby is in the right position. Everything looks normal." Isaac refused to leave Josephine's side once his tasks were complete, holding her hand through each contraction, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, and murmuring words of encouragement. "You're so strong," he told her as she gripped his hand with surprising force. "So brave." "You can do this, Josephine. I'm right here with you." As the evening wore on and the labor intensified, Josephine found strength in Isaac's unwavering presence. When fear threatened to overwhelm her, she would look into his eyes and find the courage to continue. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, marking the start of a new day, Mrs. Holden announced, "It's time to push, my dear. Your baby is ready to meet you." With Isaac supporting her back and whispering encouragement in her ear, Josephine gathered her remaining strength and pushed. The pain was extraordinary, unlike anything she had ever experienced, but beneath it was a sense of purpose, of rightness. "I can see the head," Mrs. Holden reported. "One more good push." Josephine took a deep breath and pushed with all her might. There was a moment of searing pain and then relief. The sound of a baby's cry filled the cabin, strong and indignant. "You have a daughter," Mrs. Holden announced, quickly cleaning the infant and wrapping her in a soft blanket before placing her in Josephine's arms. Josephine looked down at the tiny red face of her daughter and felt her heart expand with a love so profound, it took her breath away. The baby had a dusting of dark hair, and when she briefly opened her eyes, Josephine caught a glimpse of deep blue like Isaac's. "She's perfect," Josephine whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. Isaac leaned close, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he gazed at the newborn. "She is," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion, "just like her mother." Gently, he reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. Instantly, her fingers curled around his much larger one, holding on with surprising strength. "I think she knows her papa," Josephine said softly. Isaac looked up at her, his expression a mixture of joy and uncertainty. "Truly, you want her to call me that?" "You are her father, Isaac," Josephine said firmly. "In every way that matters." Mrs. Holden, who had been quietly cleaning up, approached the bed. "Have you chosen a name for her?" Josephine looked at Isaac questioningly. They had discussed names but had never settled on one. "What about Elizabeth?" Isaac suggested. "After your mother," Josephine felt a fresh wave of tears at his thoughtfulness. "Elizabeth Blackburn," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect." Later, after Mrs. Holden had given Josephine instructions for caring for the baby and herself, and had departed for the main house, promising to return in the morning, Isaac and Josephine found themselves alone with their daughter for the first time. Elizabeth slept peacefully in the cradle Isaac had made while her parents watched over her in wonder. "Thank you," Josephine said, reaching for Isaac's hand, "for everything, for stepping forward that day, for giving us a home, for loving us." Isaac brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You have given me more than I ever dreamed possible," he replied. "A family of my own, love, purpose." As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in hushed white, the small family inside the cabin basked in the warmth of their new beginning. The journey that had begun with abandonment and humiliation had led to something beautiful, a love born of compassion and grown through respect, culminating in the miracle of new life. In the months that followed Elizabeth's birth, the small cabin on the Rockingham Ranch transformed from a simple shelter into a true home. Isaac added a lean-to addition that served as a nursery, and Josephine planted a small garden when spring arrived, determined to make their temporary dwelling more permanent. Elizabeth thrived under their care, growing from a tiny, red-faced newborn into a chubby, smiling baby with her mother's delicate features and her father's watchful eyes. Isaac doted on her shamelessly, often bringing her small treasures from his daily work, a particularly smooth stone, a feather from a meadowlark, or wildflowers that Josephine would press between the pages of her books. Their love for each other deepened as well, evolving from the tentative affection of newlyweds into something solid and enduring. Isaac's quiet strength complemented Josephine's gentle determination, and together they weathered the challenges of new parenthood and frontier life with resilience and grace. When Elizabeth was 6 months old, Mr. Morgan called Isaac to the main house for a conversation that would change the course of their lives. "I'm getting old, Blackburn," the rancher said without preamble. "My sons have no interest in ranching. One's a lawyer in Denver, the other's chasing gold in California. I need someone I can trust to help me run this place, someone who might be interested in taking it over someday." Isaac listened, scarcely believing what he was hearing. "You're a hard worker, honest, and you know cattle," Mr. Morgan continued. "I'm offering you the position of ranch foreman with the option to buy into the ranch over time. What do you say?" Isaac didn't hesitate. "I'd be honored, sir, but I'll need to discuss it with Josephine." Mr. Morgan nodded approvingly. "A man who consults his wife, that's good. She's a fine woman, your Josephine. Bring her and that beautiful baby of yours to dinner tonight and we'll talk details." When Isaac returned to the cabin and shared the news with Josephine, her face lit up with joy. "Oh, Isaac, this is wonderful. You've worked so hard and Mr. Morgan sees it." "It would mean we'd stay here," Isaac said, watching her reaction carefully. "Make our life here permanently, is that what you want?" Josephine looked around the cabin that had become their home, then back at Isaac, her eyes shining. "Yes," she said simply. "This is where our story began. It seems right that it should continue here." That evening, as they dined with the Morgans and discussed the future of the Rockingham Ranch, Josephine felt a profound sense of gratitude. The path that had led her here had been marked by pain and uncertainty, but it had also brought her to Isaac, to Elizabeth, to this moment of possibility. A year passed, then two. Under Isaac's management, the Rockingham flourished. He had a natural gift for ranching, combining traditional methods with innovative ideas that increased productivity while treating the land and animals with respect. Josephine continued to assist with the ranch's books, but she also returned to teaching, holding classes in the main house for the children of the ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders. Elizabeth, now a precocious toddler, would sit at her mother's feet during lessons, solemnly mimicking the older children's responses. On the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, that hasty ceremony in a church filled with shocked onlookers, Isaac took Josephine for a ride to a ridge overlooking the ranch. It was a clear spring day, the prairie stretching out before them in a carpet of new green, dotted with wildflowers. "I have something for you," Isaac said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet pouch and handed it to her. Curious, Josephine opened it and gasped when a gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond slid into her palm. "Isaac." "When we married," he explained, taking her hand, "it was so sudden that I couldn't give you a proper ring. You've worn that simple band I bought from the general store without complaint, but you deserve better." He slipped the new ring onto her finger alongside her wedding band. "I promise you, Josephine Blackburn, that I will love you and our family for all the days of my life." Tears filled Josephine's eyes as she looked at the ring sparkling in the sunlight. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "but I never needed a diamond to know your love was real." Isaac smiled, pulling her close. "I know, that's just one of the countless reasons why I love you." As they sat together on the ridge, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, Josephine leaned her head on Isaac's shoulder. "Do you ever think about that day, the day we met?" Isaac was quiet for a moment before answering. "Sometimes, I think about how different our lives might have been if I hadn't been in that church, or if I hadn't found the courage to walk up to you." "I've never asked you," Josephine said hesitantly. "Why were you there that day?" "You didn't know anyone in town yet." Isaac looked out over the land that had become their home. "I was passing the church on my way to inquire about work at one of the ranches. I heard the music and something told me to go inside." He turned to meet her gaze. "Some might call it fate. Others, divine intervention. I just know that the moment I saw you standing there in your wedding dress, something inside me knew that my life was about to change forever." Josephine reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that 3 years of sun and wind had etched around his eyes. "Mine too," she said softly. They rode back to the ranch as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Elizabeth was waiting for them at the cabin, having spent the afternoon with Mrs. Morgan, who doted on the little girl as if she were her own grandchild. "Mama, Papa." Elizabeth cried, running to meet them as they dismounted. "Mrs. Morgan let me help make cookies." Isaac scooped her up, tossing her high in the air before catching her securely in his strong arms. "Did she now? And did you save any for your poor, hungry papa?" Elizabeth giggled, her dark curls bouncing. "Maybe 1 or 2, as they entered their home, no longer just a cabin but a proper house now, with rooms added as their needs had grown. Josephine felt a sense of completion. This was the life she had never dared to dream of. A loving husband, a beautiful child, meaningful work, a community that had come to respect and accept her. That night, after Elizabeth was tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Josephine and Isaac sat together on the porch, watching the moon rise over the prairie. The sounds of the ranch at night surrounded them, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of the wind through the grass, the occasional howl of a coyote far away. "I have news," Josephine said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I wasn't sure until today, but now I am." Isaac turned to look at her, curiosity in his eyes. "What is it?" Josephine took his hand and placed it on her stomach, just as she had done that October evening when they had first acknowledged their love for each other. "Elizabeth is going to have a brother or sister come winter." Joy spread across Isaac's face, lighting his eyes and bringing a smile to his lips. "A baby, we're having another baby," Josephine nodded, her own smile matching his. "Yes, our child, Isaac, truly ours from the beginning." Isaac pulled her into his arms, holding her close as emotion overcame him. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for making me the happiest man alive, for giving me a family, for loving me." "Always," Josephine promised, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had changed her life with a single act of kindness and courage. "Forever." As they held each other under the vast Montana sky, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. What had begun as a desperate arrangement, a marriage of convenience born from humiliation and necessity, had blossomed into a love story more beautiful than any she could have imagined. The pregnant bride who had been left at the altar had found not just refuge but redemption in the arms of a cowboy who had promised her forever, and had kept that promise every day since. Winter came, and with it, the birth of their son, whom they named James after Isaac's father. He arrived during a fierce blizzard, but unlike Elizabeth's birth, this time Isaac had experience to guide him when the midwife couldn't make it through the snow. With steady hands and a calm voice, he helped Josephine bring their son into the world, cutting the cord himself and placing the squalling infant on his mother's chest with tears of joy and pride in his eyes. Elizabeth, now nearly 4 years old, took to her role as big sister with enthusiasm. constantly wanting to help with the baby and talking to him in the serious, instructive tone she had learned from watching her mother teach. "James needs to learn lots of things, Mama," she declared one day as she watched Josephine nurse the baby. "I will teach him how to be good and strong like Papa." Josephine smiled at her daughter's earnestness. "I'm sure you will, sweetheart. And what about being kind and clever like your mama?" Elizabeth considered this, then nodded solemnly. "Yes, that too, but first he needs to learn how to talk and walk." As spring thawed the frozen land, bringing new growth and the bustling activity of calving season, the Blackburn family settled into their new rhythm. Isaac's days were filled with the demanding work of managing the ranch, while Josephine balanced caring for their children with her teaching and bookkeeping duties. One warm May afternoon, as Josephine sat on a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree, watching Elizabeth play while James napped beside her, she spotted a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized Thomas Wheeler. She hadn't seen him since that confrontation outside the cabin over 3 years ago. He had eventually left Dry Creek, or so she had heard, moving on to some other frontier town to seek his fortune. Instinctively, she gathered James closer and called Elizabeth to her side as Thomas drew near and dismounted. "Josephine," he said, removing his hat. He looked older, somehow diminished, his once immaculate appearance now slightly shabby around the edges. "Thomas," she replied coolly. "What brings you here?" He glanced at the children, his gaze lingering on Elizabeth, who stared back at him with Isaac's steady blue eyes. "I heard you had made quite a life for yourself," he said, his tone difficult to read. "Seems the rumors were true." "If you've come to cause trouble," Josephine began, but Thomas held up a hand to stop her. "I haven't," he said quickly. "I'm passing through on my way to Oregon, thought I might. Well, I suppose I wanted to see for myself that you were all right." Josephine was surprised by this admission. "I'm more than all right," she said, softening slightly. "This is my daughter, Elizabeth, and my son, James." Thomas nodded, a flicker of something like regret crossing his face. "They're beautiful children. You look happy, Josephine." "I am," she confirmed. "Happier than I ever thought possible." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by Elizabeth's curious questions about the stranger's fancy boots. "Well," Thomas said finally, replacing his hat, "I should be on my way. I wish you well, Josephine, truly." As he turned to leave, Josephine called after him, "Thomas." He paused, looking back. "I hope you find what you're looking for." A sad smile touched his lips. "I doubt I'll find anything as good as what I foolishly threw away, but thank you." After he had ridden away, Josephine sat for a long time, reflecting on how differently her life might have turned out if Thomas had not abandoned her that day in the church. The pain and humiliation had been overwhelming then, but now she could see that moment for what it truly was, the beginning of a journey that had led her to true happiness. When Isaac found her later, still sitting under the cottonwood with their children, he immediately sensed something had happened. "What is it?" he asked, settling beside her on the blanket and lifting James into his arms. Josephine told him about Thomas's visit, watching his face carefully for signs of anger or jealousy. But Isaac merely listened, nodding occasionally. "And how do you feel about seeing him again?" he asked when she had finished. Josephine considered the question. "Grateful," she said finally. Isaac raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Grateful? Yes," Josephine explained, reaching for his hand. "If he hadn't left me that day, I would never have known this life, never known you or our beautiful children or this place that has become our home. I would have been trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who didn't truly want me or our child." Isaac squeezed her hand, understanding in his eyes. "Then I suppose I'm grateful to him too, though I'll never forgive the way he hurt you." "Some hurts lead us to healing we never knew we needed," Josephine said softly. "Some endings are just beginnings in disguise." As they gathered their children and walked back to their home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the land, Josephine felt a profound sense of peace. The path that had led her here had not been easy or straightforward, but it had been the right one. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the fireflies begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk, Elizabeth on Isaac's lap and James sleeping in Josephine's arms, Isaac turned to his wife with a smile. "Do you remember what I promised you that day in the church?" he asked. Josephine nodded, returning his smile. "You promised me forever." "And I meant it," Isaac said, his voice low and sincere. "Every day with you and our children is a gift I never expected to receive. I plan to cherish each one for as long as I live." "As do I," Josephine replied, leaning over to kiss him softly. "As do I." The years continued to flow like the river that ran through the Rockingham Ranch, sometimes rushing forward in moments of excitement and change, sometimes meandering peacefully through days of routine and simple pleasures. The Blackburn family grew alongside the ranch, adding another daughter, Sarah, when Elizabeth was 7 and James was 3. Isaac eventually became a partner in the ranch, and when old Mr. Morgan passed away peacefully in his sleep, he left his share to Isaac in his will, making the Blackburns the sole owners of the Rockingham. Under their stewardship, it became one of the most prosperous and respected cattle operations in the territory. Josephine expanded her teaching from the informal classes at the main house to a proper school built on the ranch, where the children of ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders received an education that combined academic knowledge with practical skills needed for life on the frontier. Elizabeth, with her father's quiet strength and her mother's intelligence, grew into a capable young woman who could ride and rope as well as any cowhand, but also had a passion for books and learning. James, gentle and thoughtful, showed a talent for working with animals and an intuitive understanding of the land. Sarah, the baby of the family, combined her siblings' best qualities with a spirited independence all her own. As Montana moved from territory to statehood and the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Blackburns witnessed the transformation of the frontier. Railroads expanded, bringing new settlers and changes to the way of life they had known. But through it all, the foundation they had built, a marriage of love, respect, and partnership, remained steadfast. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Isaac surprised Josephine with a trip to Yellowstone, leaving their grown children to manage the ranch for the 2 weeks they would be away. It was a luxury they had never allowed themselves before, always putting the needs of the ranch and family first. As they stood together beside the magnificent geysers, watching in awe as Old Faithful erupted in a spectacular display of nature's power, Isaac put his arm around Josephine's shoulders, drawing her close. 25 years, he mused, his voice carrying the slight rasp of age but still strong. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I saw you standing in that church, and sometimes it feels like I've loved you for 100 lifetimes. Josephine leaned into his embrace, as comfortable and natural as breathing. "And what about the next 25 years? What do you see for us then?" Isaac smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I see us sitting on our porch, gray-haired and wrinkled, watching our grandchildren play in the yard. I see us still working side by side, still loving each other a little more each day." "That sounds perfect," Josephine said, turning in his arms to face him. Though time had silvered her hair and added its marks to her face, her eyes still held the same light that had first drawn Isaac to her. "I wouldn't change a single moment of our journey, not even the beginning." Isaac asked, a hint of their old private joke in his tone. Josephine reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar contours. "Especially not the beginning. It may have started with heartbreak, but it led me to you, the greatest blessing of my life." As they returned to the ranch, they found their children had organized a surprise anniversary celebration, inviting friends and neighbors from miles around. Under a canopy of stars, with lanterns strung among the trees and a fiddle playing sweet, old tunes, Isaac and Josephine danced together, their movements as harmonious as their lives had become. "Look at them," Elizabeth said to her siblings as they watched their parents. "Still so in love after all these years." "It's because Papa never forgot his promise," James replied, his gaze warm as he observed the couple who had taught him everything he knew about love and commitment. "What promise?" Sarah asked, always curious. Elizabeth smiled, her eyes misting slightly at the memory of a story she had heard countless times throughout her childhood. "When Mama was left at the altar, Papa stepped forward and promised her forever, and he's been keeping that promise every day since." As the music played and the night deepened, Isaac held Josephine close, whispering in her ear words of love that had only grown more profound with the passing years. And Josephine, her head resting on his shoulder, gave silent thanks for the twist of fate that had brought this extraordinary man into her life on what should have been the worst day of her existence. What had begun as a desperate arrangement between strangers had blossomed into a love story that would be told and retold through generations of Blackburns, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the promise of forever, kept faithfully through all the seasons of a shared life. And as they danced beneath the Montana sky, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built together, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that some endings truly were beginnings in disguise, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories started in the most unexpected ways.